Awesome. Thanks, everyone. Excited to be here and to talk about career ladders with you. I'm not sure that I can claim we've developed the perfect, awesome career ladder, but I can definitely tell you some lessons along the way. Some notes about this. So I'm going to go through 3 examples from my experience. Those are all going to show you real examples, so they're all pulled directly from our Google archives. So it's all real examples from the past. And I'm generally going to be talking about a software engineering career ladder. I'm pulling examples from our general SWE ladder, but I think those lessons are equally applicable across other technical ladders. Just a quick note about Flatiron, simply because I'm talking about the particular examples. I've been there 9 years, was not CTO the whole time, but what that means is that I've been able to see the progression of what we did in the ladder and what the outcomes were in the engineering ecosystem from that. So I've had that depth of experience to see that. And just for reference point, because it matters what size your company is, we're about 1,200 folks right now, about 400 of them in tech. So you may or may not have experienced career ladders before. Certainly when I was coming from a very startup-y environment, career ladders were new to me, but they typically look something like this, like a pretty vanilla Google sheet. You've got your, across one axis, you've got levels. So like here we've got E2, E3, and across another axis, you have skills that you expect people to demonstrate in that level, and you bucket them by whatever makes sense to you. This provides both a tool for being able to assess whether folks are meeting expectations, and also like a way to guide individuals towards what career progression could look like for them. Like, what does getting to the next level really mean in terms of skills and expectations? Ladders are really important. In particular, I think they're really important for fair pay, for equitable pay, because if you have an organization of 70 engineers, it's very hard to know if this person over here and this person over here are doing equivalent work and should be paid the same if you don't have some rubric to kind of assess them and put them in buckets. So I think it's really important for that. It's also an awesome opportunity for you to define what matters to you as an organization. So what are your values? What do you value in your engineering organization? They're also really challenging. So we have evolved our ladder basically every single year since we made the first one, which was 2015. I'm going to show you examples from where I could find artifacts, but I think that we probably have no words in common with our 2015 ladder at this point. So I think it's probably completely turned over. So I said I was going to tell you 3 stories, and the first one is going to be about the sort of senior IC path. And what I mean by a senior IC path, you probably know, but I'm just going to say it. It's this idea of that there is a career trajectory that does not involve management for technical folks. So this is where you say, hey, we would really get value from people who stay super technical, stay hands-on in the architecture for their entire career path without going into management. And I think this is something that we generally believe is a good thing. We talk about it in all our talks today, but it's something that actually can be really hard to get right, especially at if you're a newer company, if you're only maybe 100 people. Part of that is that other functions don't have that, right? You've probably experienced most other functions do not have this idea of growing deeper as a subject matter expert. And so you have to really establish a pattern solely for your tech crew alone. And it can be really challenging at the beginning of an organization. So we knew this was really important to us. It was something we definitely wanted to have in our career ladder. And so the first thing we did in 2015 was write a bunch of levels and say, see, these levels exist. Clearly, there is an IC path. One thing you might notice if you are savvy, these are clearly stolen from Google. Distinguished engineer, not a thing that a company at our size needs, not a thing that most companies need. And then we also defined them sort of tautologically, we define them by you're this because you're this. Also, one other thing about that is you see that we use the word systems and maybe product initiatives, words that were a little unclear as to exactly what that meant. So 2017, we wanted to clean that up a little bit. We wanted to be clear about what that scope meant. So we said, you are a E6 for us is director equivalent, so think a principal architect kind of level. We're you're an E6 if you're making substantial contributions that span applications, teams, and code bases. So at least I know what applications, teams, and code bases are. But I invite you to wonder how many very junior engineers came to me and said, well, I'm working on Jenkins, and that touches every team in this company, so why am I not a level E6? Right? So it's not perfect. So fast forward to 2020, we had exactly 2 folks at this E6 level who were IC engineers. We called them architects. This is something stolen from one of our documentation when we were about to go into our next ladder refresh, where we say the path to E6 promotion is unclear for IC individuals. This highlight is not mine. I found this document, and for some reason, this is the only line highlighted in the entire document. So clearly, it was bothering us. And here's what we did about it. We said, OK, we've been talking about scope, like, you're spanning systems, and that's not enough. You need to have impact at that scope, which I think is valid and a good insight. It answers that sort of junior engineer question. But, still not quite enough. So here's some of the updates and the behaviors that we put in there. Those 2 engineers that I had, those 2 engineers who were at this A6 level. So one of them was someone who really reveled in going to different teams, seeing what the pain points were among them, and figuring out solutions to those common pain points. She fit in this ladder super well. Her scope was really clear. No fights. The other one, her really special sauce was that she could go in and grab a problem on a team and accelerate it, make it happen fast, use whatever existing technology was there to its fullest, accelerate the other engineers on the team, and basically get shit done really fast. She was an E6 level, also was doing all these behaviors, and had a terrible time every perf cycle with what is her scope. Because it wasn't across the entire organization, it wasn't necessarily even across multiple teams, and so she did not fit in this paradigm very well at all. So fast forward to last year. We finally do something which we probably should have done a long time ago, was to make a formal split track in our IC path. So those 2 engineers are now 2 different archetypes. We call one principal, that's saying, you're going deep on a problem in a technical area, and we have architect, which is you are going wide, you are solving problems across a lot of different groups. I fought this either intentionally or unintentionally for a long time because it clearly adds complexity. You see these 2 tracks here. Imagine that there's a whole other track here, which is management. So now you've got like this 3 split track in your engineering ladder. It is more complicated than it was before. But the thing that I didn't realize, and the reason this has been actually a really good idea, is that complexity existed. Not acknowledging it in the ladder was not solving anything. It was actually just pushing it down to individual managers to deal with. So the act of actually formalizing this has been really, really helpful. You can see here like some more of those technical skills and like more of the way we've defined it. One other thing that we realized when we did this, and I think the principal definition really helped us, was realize that we actually needed to be opinionated about where we needed these individuals. So it's not just about like, where is talent up and coming, where are people doing really well, but where can folks doing these behaviors actually accelerate us as a company, and particularly in the principal space. So for example, we rely really heavily on machine learning. It's a big part of our infrastructure, and so machine learning infrastructure is an area where it's really important to me to have someone who's acting as a principal to accelerate that and make sure we're doing well in that area. That wouldn't have been true 7 years ago, and that may not be true for you depending on how your organization is designed. So it's really a question of where do you need that injection of senior talent. And actually, just to close that out, we've got, I think today, like 7 folks who are principals and architects. So in that kind of 1 to 3 year period, we managed to triple the number. And it's much easier to talk about in our performance management process, whether or not someone is meeting the expectations of scope. And I have many fewer people coming to me and saying, hey, this path is really unclear. So just to sum up, like in this section, kind of in this story, what worked. When you talk about scope and you don't talk about impact, not great, don't do it. This idea of like separating out, embracing the complexity, separating out depth versus breadth has honestly really worked for us. This being opinionated from the top, and the snowballing. So once there were a couple examples from each bucket and people could see and say, oh, I see, so-and-so does this, there's a lot of value to that, and it snowballed, and we had more people sort of saying, I understand who that is. Let's talk a bit about unintended consequences. So words have power. One of the things that I find to be true in engineering ladders is that it's really easy to define junior levels. Folks who are progressing from like a new grad to like a senior engineer level, it's usually by doing core skills better, right? So they're doing code reviews without as many comments, or they're going from not understanding production technology to being able to deploy things in production. It's like a pretty natural, easy evolution, and it's clear how that adds value to the company. And then you get to something like a staff level or an architect level, and things go off the rails, because often we start talking about those things in terms of complexity or system ownership, things that aren't necessarily as clear in terms of their value to the company. So here's a couple, I'm going to say, fairly cherry-picked examples from various areas of our ladder, and these are all staff software expectations. And you can see we said things like, you're going to have end-to-end responsibility on projects of increasing complexity. You're going to design new systems of high technical complexity. I think you can guess what my next slide is, which is, are you surprised that when we did a survey of our managers in 2023, they said, you know, one of the problems with the ladder is that people are really incentivized to come up with large scope, complex projects to get promotions. Oh, and those projects are not necessarily aligned with, you know, the business needs or the goals. I'm going to also say that this is also Google's fault to some extent. This is at least how we understand their ladder to work, how people think it works. And so I don't think our ladder was that rifled with these things, but there was enough of it for people to read into it and say, aha, I know this pattern, this is Google, I have to build new things, I have to build more complex things in order to get promoted. So here are some of our mitigations for it. So one thing is that we certainly, wherever we could, stripped out language about complexity. And this is kind of scary, because when you think about, what do I need a staff engineer to be? What do I need someone who can have complete ownership of a system to be? The reason we talk about complexity is we're like, well, we wanted them to have like seen some stuff and like know some stuff. But it wasn't serving us, so we tried to strip it out and replace it with more specificity about things, that behaviors that we knew we needed to see, that we want to see, that are good for our organization. So you see like project end of life, something that's really important at all phases of a company, but particularly as you're doing a transition from maybe a really startup phase to more of a mature phase. Things like consistently makes production code and systems easier to understand. Really going from, hey, you're awesome because you did a lot of complex things, to how are you making this ecosystem continuously better? How are you improving it over time? I'm not going to say this is a solved problem. I mean, you saw that survey was from 2023, so I'm clearly not saying that this is completely solved. I do think the specificity is helping, being able to point to things and say, like, you're not just rewarded for building a giant new thing, but you're also going to be rewarded for deciding that this thing isn't serving us any form, or making something simpler, for increasing the stability. I think those are really important signals that people need to see, and questions that we've started to ask in our performance reviews. Something else that's not ladder related at all is honestly more top-down direction. So it's much easier for people to go off half-cocked if they don't really know what they're expected to do. So the less top-down direction, the less sort of clarity you have about team goals, the easier it is for your senior engineer to say, you know, what we really need to solve this is we really need a new system that does X, Y, and Z. I say this as someone who's worked, our company's been very bottoms up. So if you are a very top-down company, you may have an opposite problem, but certainly there's a place where giving clarity is very helpful here. Okay, this last topic is a little bit different from the other two. And I'm calling it cultural contributions. What do I mean by that? Back in 2015, when we wrote this ladder, Flatiron was like, I don't know, 150 people, something like that. And we knew a couple of things. We knew that we were growing really rapidly, and we're going to continue to grow really rapidly. We ended up being in hypergrowth all the way to 2020. And we knew that in order to do that and make that successful, we were going to need help from every individual in the organization. We were going to need their help in recruiting and onboarding and mentoring and scaling everything that we had in the organization. We also knew that we had a really good company culture. What I mean by that is we were really collaborative, we had great cross-functional communication, and I think by the time I joined in 2014, they were on Hackathon 5. So a year and a half into the time there, they had run 5 hackathons. So they had like some good, I would say, like peripheral things around what makes a fun engineering organization, what makes a constructive engineering organization. So we knew that all of those things were important to us. So when we made the ladder in 2015, we put it in. We said, hey, all that stuff, all that glue work is really important. It should be in our ladder. This happens to be from 2017 because it made a better screenshot, but it was there the whole time. We got pretty specific about what we were looking for. So I mentioned that, you know, mentoring and onboarding and recruiting were important, and you see lanes for that there. I'm going to be honest, cross-functional domain expertise feels like a little bit of a grab bag for something that we knew we wanted to value because we're in healthcare but didn't really know where to put. So we did this. We threw this in. And something that worked really well, a real benefit of this, was that our IC engineers really strongly participated in the running of our engineering organization. So we had folks volunteering to run our internship program. I ran recruiting for years, but I always had a ton of support from people under me, reviewing our interview kits and thinking about novel ways to change stuff. It was really a team effort from every single individual in the organization, and that was a huge outcome of this. But also, culture as a ladder didn't work exceptionally well. There are a couple reasons for this. One, because we had to fill out an entire ladder. So we had everything from your new grads all the way through your architects, having cultural expectations. We ended up mixing some stuff that was like pretty table stakes with some really optional things. So acts as a good teammate, or shows up to interviews is not in the same bucket as writes a blog post or runs hackathon. And so those were very conflated, and it made it unclear what was just a fundamental expectation of employment versus what was really an additional thing from a cultural perspective. The other thing is we built it as a ladder, and so when you got more senior, we expected our architects and our directors to do a lot more of the work. We put things like running big initiatives in that bucket. But what we actually saw was the opposite. We saw that when folks were more junior, coming in as new grads or junior hires, they're the ones who had the time and also kind of the initiative and energy and the desire to run those things. I think some of that is that folks who had a leadership bent, who hadn't necessarily earned the badge of being able to do that in the technical arena, could do that in these other arenas. They could run a big event, they could run a social thing, and get to kind of prove themselves a little bit that way. So it was actually kind of flipped. Rather than the senior people doing more work, it was actually kind of the junior people who were doing more work. And then because of that, you'd have people saying, hey, I ran this giant event and it was super successful. That's in the E6 part of the ladder. I'm in E2. Should I be promoted based on this? And it's always a hard question. I think there's a whole talk that I love about glue and like how much you want to reward that. But I do think there's a reality that running a hackathon or running a social event does not make you a more senior engineer. And so we really weren't going to promote people based on this. And that also made it a bad characteristic of a ladder. So what we ended up doing in 2019 was scrapping it as a ladder and making it a rating instead. So instead of saying, hey, you should be progressing on this thing throughout your career, we said, hey, every year or every perf cycle, we're going to kind of add up all the stuff that you did, and we're going to put you in one of these buckets based on kind of how impactful it was, how big a lift you did. And then, maybe there'll be some kind of consequences of that. Maybe there's some additional compensation. Maybe there's some out-of-band rewards like more mentorship or coaching dollars. But it became a rating instead of a ladder level. That ended up, I think, working much better. So here's some examples. We ended up making it a lot less specific, so a lot less proscriptive. So we switched to examples instead of like thou shalt, and ended up getting a lot better result. I would say we still very much have a culture of people participating. Oh, I should actually say we also defined culture, which I think is a word that I still don't love. But we defined culture as basically all the stuff that is not really your job. Like you could not do it and you'd be still doing your job. So under that definition, being a good teammate is part of your job. But again, like running hackathon, you could not do that and you would still be doing your job pretty well. So I think the things that I would take out of this and the things that worked really well was recognizing that there are things that are important to us that are not ladder-shaped. And so not everything can be shoved into your ladder. But that those things still have value, including in your performance review process. So that act of getting evaluated, of having managers ask questions, of talking it through, really caused a recognition that still means that even though it's no longer part of our ladder, and even though the rewards are not excessive and certainly not to the level of sort of getting promoted, we still have a culture of every single person in our organization contributing. It's an expectation, and I think it's really important because it means that that is not falling, first of all, potentially on leaders who are burnt out or not excited about doing it, but also it's not falling on our underrepresented group. It's not falling on women, people of color, and I think that's also really, really important. Okay, so to just kind of sum up a couple themes coming all of this, one of them is getting really specific. So I mentioned it when I talked about unintended consequences. I think it's also a theme of that senior IC track, which is that we sort of started with a template of like, what does a company look like? what does a senior engineer look like? Oh, they look like a person who does things that are more complex. And the more we got specific about, okay, but what do we actually need that person to do? The more we thought about what does our company need, the better off we were. You will get the behavior you reward, even when you don't want it. So be really careful with words. People will interpret them in all sorts of ways, and honestly be prepared for that and be prepared to have to change out words in reasons that you think are like absurd. I've definitely had to go in and say, well, I can't use this word anymore because people have decided that it means that front-end people are not actually engineers, and so I can no longer use this word even though it is a perfectly fine word. System was one of those words. Front-end engineers do not like the word systems. They thought this excludes us, so I had to change it. And some things aren't ladders. So there are things you care about. There are things that you should really actively include in your perf process that are not actually ladders that people climb. And it's an important part of performance management, and you got to figure out some other way to do it. And with that, I think we can turn it over for questions, if any.
Thank you so much, Kat. That was honestly such a relatable presentation, I think probably for all of us. And yeah, I think I really love point number 2. It really goes to show that you could really push people to do things in the right direction or have it kind of backfire depending on how you do it. So getting this right is super important.
And people are primed by what they've seen elsewhere too. It's really interesting.
Exactly. And that, yeah, to the point number 1, like just making sure that it's to what your company wants, not just Google, you know. Okay, so I'm really excited to jump into the Q&A. We got the first one here, which is, by going too specific, how do you avoid it being a checkbox exercise for promotion expectation?
I mean, great question. That super resonates. I think some of it is actually, I think everyone does some version of this. There's like swim lanes, and then there's sub-swim lanes. And so in a sub-swim lane, there's not just one behavior, there's maybe like 4 or 5. And I think something that's actually helped is getting specific in a way that it's very clear that one individual is not necessarily doing all of those things. So like, it is not a requirement to get promoted to an architect that you have end-of-life to system, but it's something that will reward. So there's like I think if you have enough examples, that has helped. I will say it's still something it's something we talked a lot about, I would say 4 or 5 years ago, people really feeling like, well, this is a check-the-box situation and I have to do all those things. I'm also going to say, and this is not a solved problem for me, I think it is a check-the-box situation often when you're talking about going from new grad to like the next level up. So like in our case, in E2 to E3, it's like, yeah, you have to do code reviews independently, and yeah, your code has to be well tested, like all of those things. And the more senior you get, the more it's like, well, here's some ways that you could demonstrate. Somehow it's become embedded in our cultural understanding that is the case, but I think it's a really, really valid question that I don't have a perfect answer to. But I think making it clear that it's not possible to do all of them is maybe one way to avoid the checkbox situation.
Love that. Let's go to the next one. Do you publicly celebrate promotions, and why or why not?
I'm actually really curious. Can I get a poll of the room? How many of you celebrate promotions publicly? Yeah, it's most of us, but not some. So yes, but like not hugely. I'm actually always really cognizant when I celebrate promotions that there's someone who is just on the cusp who's like really bitter and angry or just really sad about the fact they didn't get it. So I think it's a delicate balance. We send out an email, we congratulate folks, but I think that I always feel like I don't want to overdo it because I know there were people who were so close who are not included in that, who are feeling bad. And I think the promotion is to some extent the reward in and of itself, but I'll always personally congratulate people. So I think I'll also say there's a difference between public and private, and I think the private celebration is really important, and like letting folks know, especially folks in my organization who are a skip or below, like, I saw that you got promoted, that's awesome, I heard all the amazing things you did.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's go to the next one. Oh, I love this one. How many criteria is too many?
I think you got to look in your soul. I guess I wonder, is this criteria, are we thinking about like, so I guess we're thinking about like within a level, like how many criteria do you have? I think this comes back to at junior levels, it's a list of things that you have to do. And at senior levels, it's a list of examples. So I think in some sense, the more senior you get, the more examples you can and should give of ways to get there. And at the junior levels, I think if we looked at our entire like E3, which is our sort of one step above new grad level, it's actually pretty sparse because you really should be doing all of those things. I think that, I don't know that there's a perfect answer here, but if you're spending a lot of time and you're worried about how many you have, it might be time to cull them down. Not a perfect answer, I'm sorry.
Yeah, we go to the next one here. We're really getting through a lot. This is great. So how to balance between meeting expectations across all aspects of a ladder versus excelling at one, but not necessarily in some.
I love this because we debate this a lot. So something I didn't talk about, it was one of the things I considered for this talk, is that we used to actually have more swim lanes. So when we do performance evaluations, we actually have two, I said we got rid of culture, we basically have two swim lanes. And one is like technical skill, and one is kind of like product skill, by which I mean we don't expect our engineers to be product managers, but we expect them to be able to work with stakeholders and gather requirements and basically build the thing that they're supposed to be building, not some random other thing. It actually started as our original ladder level was a get shit done, which was basically our CTO at the time saying, I really don't want people to get praised for like building complex systems but never shipping anything. So why am I talking about that? Because we definitely sometimes have people who really excel in one and are not performing at the next level. This is also true for managers. So there's a manager section for folks who are managers. And it's definitely possible, for example, for someone to be like an awesome manager and they're holding their team accountable and they are giving people good career advice and all the rest of it. But like they're not doing that much technical stuff and it's really hard to evaluate on the rest of it. I would say the way we've thought about it, and it's not a perfect system, but if you want to think about it formulaically, if someone's performing at a high next level on one thing and slightly below next level on another thing, I'm willing to promote them, but I'm not willing to like do much more than that or go much further than that. And the reason is like there's some table stakes stuff in there. So I just said that we basically only have two swim lanes. If you're not hitting the technical lane and you're an IC, what are we doing here? And if you're not hitting the product lane, that means that there are probably places where you're having friction with other teams. You have great ideas, but you're struggling to sell them to other people. You're building things that people don't need. None of those are behaviors I want. So the way we've kind of settled, and it depends on the shape of your ladder, so I don't want to say this is like a one-size-fits-all answer. But if your ladder is shaped in such a way, I think that actually you really need to hold people to sort of excelling in all areas. It's hard because you'll have some like technical rock star who solved like some really specific problem that you want to reward, but then they like caused friction in the rest of your organization. So I think my lesson from seeing that over and over again is like don't reward your brilliant superstars who cause problems because those problems will come to bite you, even though it feels like you should and even though you're risking losing them by not doing it.
Yeah. That definitely makes a lot of sense. Yeah, I think in my experience has been similar to like normally, you need to meet all the expectations. In some cases, though, there might be some where like we classify as like this is the minimum bar that you need to hit, and then like these are like, you should work on them, but it's not 100% required.
And something else you might think about there is where do you have a lack of evidence versus a negative evidence? So something that this has come up with is like we have a production sort of swim lane, which is like, what is your sort of ability to work on call? What is your ability to sort of debug issues in production? And some people are on teams where that's just not relevant. And so sometimes we said, it's okay, we have a lack of signal there. We're actually changing that now because it turns out that production's really, really important. And having people who can't work in is not great. But that's another thing you can kind of decide for yourself where you are as a company.
Awesome. Well, we are out of time for Q&A. We got through a ton, so that's awesome. But we got one more that I'm ending with for all speakers. So what is one book that you would recommend to the audience that has changed the way you work or live your life?
So a book I've been thinking about a lot lately is called Switch by Chip and Dan Heath. And the part of it that's really resonating for me, and I read this book, 5 or 6 years ago, because my CTO handed it to me and was like, you have to read this. I was like, fine. It's about managing change. And I know that I find myself in a situation where I think that as an organization, we're a little bit behind in terms of developer experience. So that last panel felt really resonant for me. And so it's about how do you drive change. And one of the things it talks about is looking for bright spots. So as CTO, it's not my job to know the answer to every single thing and know how we're going to get out of it. It's my job to identify the problem areas and then look for bright spots and encourage them. That's something that's talked a lot about in the book, and it's something that I talk about with my team all the time.
Love it. Thank you so much. Let's give it up for Kat.
Thanks, guys.